Hello everyone, my name is Luis Escudero. Welcome back to another episode of Tequila Talks. Today we're going to be talking about how tequila is actually made. Tequila has a very long process and can be very time consuming from the beginning stages of harvesting and cultivation all the way to the final product of bottling. The first step in this process is the cultivation, or the Jima, which is a Spanish word for cultivation. Agaves typically take anywhere between 7 to 10 years to fully mature and for the agaves to reach peak sugar content. The agaves are then harvested by jimadores, which use a sharp tool called a coa to perfectly shave off the green leaves from the agave and perfectly expose the core, the corazón, the heart of the agave called the piña. Piña in Spanish means pineapple, and if you look at those hearts of the agave, they resemble pineapples when they're perfectly shaved by the jimadores. The next step, once these jimadores and the cultivation process is finished, these agaves are then taken to the distillery, transported by trucks, sometimes by mule, and the next step begins, the hydrolysis or cooking of the agave. The agaves need to be cooked to be able to break down complex sugars into more simple sugars for the fermentation process. These agaves are cooked in brick ovens or autoclaves, and now more modern industrial techniques use diffusers. But the time-honored tradition is the brick oven cooking method. Back when tequila production first began, ancestral underground ovens were used for these cooking methods, but now that's more of a mezcal production technique that infuses the tequilas or the mezcals with these smoky characteristics. The cooking can take anywhere between 48 to 72 hours once they're cooked in these brick ovens, but other distilleries have gone a different route where they're choosing to use autoclaves to speed up the cooking process, which can cut down that cooking time down to 12 hours. But for a purist tequila drinker, we are always looking for tequilas that are made with this specific brick oven cooking method that takes a little bit more time and really breaks these agave sugars down. Once these agave sugars are perfectly broken and these piñas are perfectly caramelized, we fall into the next step of the production, which is the milling. The milling is the actual crushing or the breaking down of these agaves to extract those sweet sugars from the core, the piña. Milling can be done in a few different ways. We have the roller mill, which again is a more industrial method that is probably the most efficient way to extract all the sugar from the fibers of the agave, but the time-honored methods use the tahona process, which the tahona process of milling uses a tahona volcanic stone that crushes and grinds these agaves slowly to give it a more ancestral, more organic crushing method. And this is where the time-honored methods back in the day when tequila production first began, this is what was being used. The tahona mill, that was, this volcanic stone was being hauled around by donkeys or mules and slowly crushing these agaves. The goal of the milling process again is to extract these agave sugars so that we can begin the fermentation process. Fermentation is the action of taking sugars and turning them into alcohol by the use and by the help of yeast. The fermentation can be done in a few various ways. Wooden tanks, stainless steel tanks, or clay tanks or pools can be used for this fermentation process to begin, but fermentation is best done in the wooden tank. Again, these are more time-honored executions, but stainless steel is now preferred by a lot of distilleries because the stainless steel doesn't break down as quickly as the wooden tanks. Natural airborne yeasts are typically used, but some distilleries will also use their own proprietary yeast to break down these sugars into alcohols. What is left over is a product called mosto, or an agave beer. This mosto is what then is going to be used for the next step of the process, which is the distillation. Now, to talk a little bit about distillation, which is the final phase before bottling, an important part of the fermentation process to produce this mosto is also a fermentation technique that uses the bagazo, which is the agave fiber that gets placed into these fermentation vats that adds a little bit more character and agave presence into the mosto. The mosto is then transitioned into copper pot stills, which will be used for the distillation. The technique of distillation is called alembic distillation, which pretty much is the heating up of the liquid, the evaporation of the alcohol vapors, and then the condensation and the capturing of these finer alcohols, or the preferred alcohols. So at the beginning, when we begin the distillation process, we have the heads, we have the heart, and then we have the tails. The heads are the most volatile compounds, and these compounds are discarded, and we don't want to use these for the next phase of distillation. And then the corazón, or the heart, are these compounds that are going to be redistilled to again repurify the tequila. The first phase of distillation and the first product of distillation is called ordinario tequila. The ordinario tends to be a little bit more cloudy, and then this liquid is redistilled again to produce our final product, which is tequila. At the very bottom of the distillation columns or the distillation tanks, we have the tails, or the vinaza. The vinaza is these are heavy compounds and bitter compounds that do not want to be bottled, and typically these are either the bagaza is composted, so the fibers that are used get composted, but the vinaza is typically thrown out or repurposed. If the water is extracted properly, the water can be repurposed for irrigation, but typically those really heavy compounds get thrown out. Now, the next step after distillation is the bottling of the tequila, which blanco tequilas are immediately bottled after distillation, but can also then be aged in oak barrels. This can technically be the last phase of the tequila production method, is once these tequilas are then placed in barrels, it typically can take anywhere between 2 months to up to as many years that the distillery chooses to age the tequilas to produce reposados, añejos, extra añejos, or any specific blends of any of each of the tequilas. Now, let's recap everything that we talked about this evening on how tequila is actually made. First, we want to cultivate, or the Jima of the agaves. The cultivation process is very important, and we must make sure that the agaves have reached peak maturation so that the piñas have the highest sugar content. Then we transition into the hydrolysis, or the cooking of the agave. This cooking method can be done in brick ovens that typically take about 72 hours to fully cook, or more industrial methods now use autoclaves that can break down this cooking time all the way down to 12 hours. After cooking is done, we then take it to the milling process, which is the extraction of the agave sugars. And this extraction can be done in a few different ways: the roller mill or the tahona process. The tahona mill is a more time-honored method that uses a volcanic tahona stone, and the roller mill is an industrialized method that crushes and injects water into these agaves to extract as much sugar as possible. Upon milling, then we go into the fermentation, which the fermentation is a process of breaking down these sugars into alcohols. The fermentation uses the help of yeast to speed up and help this process of breaking down sugars into alcohols. Some different fermentation techniques call for the insertion of the bagazo, which is the actual agave fiber that goes into these fermentation vats. And the fermentation vats or tanks can be made out of wood, stainless steel, or clay. Upon fermentation, then we move to the distillation, which is the evaporation of the alcohols from the mosto. The mosto is the agave beer that contains all the alcohols, the heads, the heart, and the tails. We want to discard the heads and the tails and keep the heart of the tequila. Upon the first distillation, we have the ordinario, And then the final distillation produces tequila, anywhere between 35% to 55% alcohol by volume. After distillation, we can then immediately bottle to produce a blanco tequila, or we can place it in barrels to produce reposados, añejos, or extra añejos, or blend them to produce tequilas jóvenes. Thank you again for tuning in this evening. Please leave me a comment if you have any questions about the actual production method on how tequila is made. Give my video a like, hit the subscribe button, and we'll see you next time on Tequila Talks. Thank you very much.